Study Session 4 Roman Education Before and After Hellenization. Introduction. In this study session, we shall examine the type of education existing in Rome before the Greek influence. We would also explore the type of education that developed in the Roman world after the Greek influence. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to discuss the traditional Roman education, highlight the influence of Greece on Roman education, and compare the family education in Rome with the African traditional education. Roman education before Greek influence. By 275 BC, Rome had united Italy under its control. By 200 BC, as a result of the Punic Wars with Carthage, Rome had the control of Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, and Spain. Thereafter, Rome turned her attention to the east and annexed Macedonia, Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, and the entire Mediterranean world under her control by 30 BC. With the Roman conquest of Greece, Greek education spread to Rome. The influence of Greek education on the Roman world is referred to as Hellenization. Tip: the main goal of the traditional Roman education was inculcation of good character, to produce someone who was manly, courageous, strong, and energetic. He should be able to stand among his fellows, proud and unflinching, conscious of his virility. The young Roman learned early that he lived in a world of unseen but powerful spirits. His ancestors were supposed to be watching over him, and they demanded reverence and respect. They were also expected to inculcate such basic characteristics as modesty, dignity of bearing, frugality, and a dogged perseverance. A Roman was also expected to be responsible in whatever relationship he found himself. Responsibility to himself, to his fellows, and to the spiritual forces of his universe. A Roman child was born into the Roman family. The family served as an institution dedicated to acculturating the young. The family was to teach the young ones the ancient virtues and ideals. The family would impress upon the young ones the importance of obedience to the authority, manliness, reverence, and all other traits of a good man. In the family, the father had absolute authority and was not to be questioned or challenged. He was to discipline his family and to ensure that they all knew their duties and discharged them well. Tip: the family was the major education unit of the Roman society. The mother was the child's principal teacher. She was dedicated to her children. Very early, however, the father gave major concern to the education of his son. As soon as possible, the boy accompanied his father, watched, learned, and received the discipline necessary. He learned the skills and obligations of a Roman gentleman. The father felt that no other person could be worthy of educating his son. No slave could be allowed to discipline the boy. The mother felt an equal responsibility for the education of the girls in the family. It was only natural that Rome should fall under the spell of Greece and open her arms to Greek scholars and teachers. While many Greeks had come to Rome in earlier times to trade or share in the growth and development of the Italian peninsula. The event that opened Rome to Greek influence was the fall of Tarentum in 272 BC. Many Greek citizens of this city were brought to Rome as captives. A number of these were freed in time and turned their attention to translating Greek classics into Latin. Commenting on the Roman family education, Barclay remarked, "The education of the Roman child was never in its best days standardized. To him, there was no prescribed curriculum, nor an impending examination or state interference in any way, all because the child was not educated in a school, but in the family. The children were made to learn the job of their parents. They also accompanied their parents to important state meetings and watched them as they debated important state matters." Patria Potestas. The family was thus so important for the child's education of the ancient Roman child. This was in fact inevitable because of the Patria Potestas, that unique power, extending even to the power of life and death, which a Roman father possessed over his child, so long as the child should live. In the traditional Roman education, the mother was very essential in the child's early education. Even in the greatest families, the mother considered it an honor to stay at home so that she could do her duty and be, as it were, a servant to her children. However, if for some reasons the mother was unable to do her job properly, a governess was chosen to look after the child. This governess was always a relative, a woman of experience, whom all the family respected, and a person who knew how to maintain an atmosphere of severity and a high moral tone. During the first 7 years of life, the child's main influence was his mother. Thereafter, there came into the child's life a deliberate association with his father, which at its best and its highest must have been a very wonderful and a very lovely thing. From then on, the child was attached to his father in such a way that his father was one constant companion and his teacher. In fact, the father was looked upon as the child's real teacher, and the child was expected to behave more or less like the father. Tip: at age of 16 years, the home education for the boys will come to an end. The child will thereafter proceed to the next stage, which will be marked by a ceremony. In fact, the Roman child was expected to undergo 2 other distinct types of training. After the home education, the first was education for public life, referred to as trisynomial fori, and second was the military service. In the education for public life, the responsibility was shifted to an old friend of the family, who must have had lots of political experience, unless there was some exceptional reason. In fact, he should be someone rich in years, experience, and honor. Cicero, for example, described how his father put him under one Mucius Scaevola Augur, who was one of the generation of Gracchi. Young Cicero went everywhere with him, not missing any opportunity that came his way to learn from him. In fact, Cicero admitted that it was through him that he, Cicero, first began to study law, a service which he was later to pass on to several of his young friends. Thereafter, the Tyrosinium Fury was supposed to end after a year, and the young Roman was supposed to go off to the army. After the military service, the Roman child was free to choose a career of his choice. Thus, the young aristocrat went on following a successful politician around. Cicero, for example, remained with his master Scavello Ugo until the old man died. The association with such a man would go on for at least a year, and often for much longer, until at least the young Roman was fully equipped to launch out on the service. The first year was spent in the ranks, for potential leaders had first to learn to obey. It would, however, be to the advantage of his political career if he was wounded or did something striking in battle. Young Scipio, for instance, the future Africanus, saved his father the consul when he was wounded at the Battle of Ticinus. Perhaps a closer examination of the content of this old Roman system of education reveals the fact that it was an education meant for including a rigid system of moral values and the development of the young man's conscience. In fact, it was education for promoting the Roman ideal, which meant lots of sacrifice, renunciation, absolute devotion to the community and the state. The striking feature of the Roman ideal was that it was never questioned. Any Roman hero was the man who, by his courage or wisdom, and in the face of great difficulties, saved his country when it is in danger. Another important characteristic of Roman education was that it aimed at developing such virtues as hard work, regality, and severity. The Romans cared very much that their children should acquire and embody the moral and social virtues. Such virtues included patriotism, justice, truthfulness, and gravitas. Any Roman child would be taught to denounce luxury and its corrupting influence. That gravitas was a thing of character. In fact, it was towards the production of character that early Roman education was entirely directed. The ideal education to them was a training which should equip a man for his duty to the gods, the state, and the family. What was wanted, according to them, was the will to do well and justly, and the instinctive hatred of all evils and unjust dealing. According to Cicero, the aim of education was to produce self-controlled person combined with dutiful affection of parents and kindness to kindred. Perhaps one could argue further that another fundamental idea towards the ancient Roman education was respect for the old custom of the ancestors, which they called moi marum. It could be observed that Roman education before Hellenization was not the kind of education which consisted of acquiring certificates or obtaining degrees. It was purely initiation into a way of life and a tradition of learning by observation and participation. Perhaps the tragedy of this system of education was that in the nature of things, it was doomed to extinction. The sting of the tragedy lies in the fact that it was the increasing greatness of the Roman Empire which killed the ancient greatness of Roman education. By its very nature, this early Roman education was only possible in a comparatively small and limited society, since it depended mainly on the father. But when Rome became an empire, the father became much more involved in military service and was unable to see his family for years. Thus, the father was unable to give his time to that unique friendship with his son, which had been the distinguishing mark of that early Roman education. Hence, when the scope and the tempo of life changed, when the essential peasant education had to do with an urban civilization, change was bound to take place. A school system was bound to arise, and so it did arise, under the influence of the Greeks in the Hellenization of the ancient world. Greek influence on Roman education. During the early part of Roman domination, both the traditional Roman education was practiced side by side with the Greek education. In Rome, during this period, there were the conservatives who hated innovations and adhered strictly to the Roman traditional education. On the other hand, the Greek education had been finding its way into the Roman life. Some wealthy Roman parents usually went to Greece to buy slaves that were well read, and these were brought to Rome to find schools, and they charged small fees for their job. Consequently, Greek education increasingly had a great influence on Roma's education. The Greek education and philosophy soon infiltrated the lives of Roman, and the captive soon took the captor captive. In other words, although Rome had captured Greece militarily, in the realm of ideology and the spread of civilization and culture, Greece was indeed the victor. Thus, after the Roman victory, those aspects of Greek civilization and culture that was of utilitarian value for the New World that was then emerging was absorbed in Rome. The Romans began to build schools similar to those of Greece. In essence, the kinds of civilization and literature that emerged were only in Roman in form, but Greek in content. That explains why in our Latin books we read of Greek in content. It also explains why in our Latin books we read of Greek heroes like Homer and Iliad, all written in Latin, the language of ancient Rome. It may be interesting to examine structure of Roman education after the Greeks' influence. Ludos. Ludos is a word meaning play. The Ludos accepted children at about 7 years. This was the lowest stage in the educational ladder of ancient Rome. It is similar to our modern primary school and specialized in the teaching of the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic, that is, counting. Counting was done with abacus under the supervision of a teacher. Probably some of these schools could have existed before the 3rd century BC, but secondary education probably came with Greek influence. Grammaticus. This was the grammar school providing secondary education. The Grammaticus accepted the child at the age of 12 and kept him for 3 or 4 years on reading, writing the poets, and arithmetic. Here, the grammar taught was Greek grammar and not Latin grammar, as might probably be expected. The situation might be compared with the English grammar school teaching Latin grammar or the Nigerian grammar school teaching English grammar. Emphasis always was on a foreign language. The schools taught more practical subjects than the music schools and gymnasia of Greece. Roman education was therefore utilitarian rather than liberal. Later, following a call by Cicero, the great Roman poet and orator, Roman literature and rhetoric were written in Latin, and Latin grammar and literature were taught in the grammatici. Higher education. This was also known as rhetoric school. It was obtained in one of two ways, either by learning rhetoric and literature abroad, in Greece or other Mediterranean cities, that is, only wealthy men could afford to send their children out of Rome, or by receiving instruction under Greek teachers in Rome, that is, less wealthy ones could easily afford to employ such teachers for their children. The rhetoric school required several years to teach the varied knowledge of history, literature, philosophy, science, and other subjects that would produce an orator. Tip: it is important to note that the type of formal education we have in Nigeria today is the result of the Greek influence in Roman education. Study session summary. In this study session, we explore the types of education available in Rome before Hellenization and education after the Greek influence. The backbone of the earliest Roman education was the family. The father possessed the unique power of life and death over the child. This was called patria potestas. Another stage in Roman life was tirocinium fori, when the young Roman was attached to men who were wise and renowned for training. With the conquest of Greece, Greek education spread to Rome, and the Romans began to build schools similar to those of Greece. Schools such as Ludos, Grammaticus, and Rhetoric, or higher schools, soon developed in Rome. End of study session 4. Thank you for listening.